Um, Thank you for coming to hear more about the education system in Kenya. So, I'll just to give you some background of how we structured our presentation as we were preparing for it. We kind of thought about hopefully giving you some kind of background on the country and the education system, and then hopefully opening it up for questions so that you can kind of get more direct responses to what what might be of interest to you. So we started off just by the introduction of Kenya, and then we'll go into the history of education in Kenya, Kenya's education system, and then we'll discuss some of the education reforms, policies, and the concerns with the reforms and the policies, and then at the end, if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about our activist work in Kenya, and if there's time, we'll talk about our doctoral research. And so just to give you context, Kenya is located here in East Africa, right here, next to Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia. So kind of right in the middle, kind of near the middle east of the continent. And the official languages in the country are English and Swahili, and English is what businesses run on. Swahili is what kind of is used in the market, everyday life conversations. And then the population is about 43 million. And there's some information there kind of to give you context of employment, labor, and inflation and such things. And a lot of these are from the CIA World Factbook and different Kenyan labor resource information sources. And let me just point you out to literacy, which is what we'll be talking a lot about. Looking at those figures, the total population literacy rate is 87.4%, so fairly high. And then with males at 90.6 and females at 84.2. But the interesting thing is, which we'll have a continued conversation about, is thinking about what actually that means in terms of quality of education. And so to look at that, actually, we have a short clip that we're going to show you to kind of give you a context of what the system is like in Kenya. Coming out of the a local Kenyan station kind of gives you a context of you have these high literacy rates, but at the same time, it's not necessarily reflecting on what the competency of the students are. So attached there, and I think the PowerPoint will be up on the website after, so attached there is a report from the Education for All that kind of breaks down what that looks like specifically.
Okay, I'll go on and present about education in Kenya from pre-colonial time up to now. So education in Kenya before colonization was mostly done within various communities. It was indigenous education, and it was done through during the rites of passage initiation. The young people imitated the older ones, there was role modeling, and there was also apprenticeship if you wanted to be, say, a blacksmith. There was also, the people who were custodians of education then were mostly the elders. So the women socialized the girls, and the men socialized the boys. At the coast of Kenya, there were Quranic schools, and these schools still exist. They've been there since the 7th century, and they emanated from the trade between the Arabs and the Persians and the conquering of the coastal area by the Arabs. Then in 1846, missionaries came into Kenya. At the coast of Kenya, a place called Rabai, the first missionary school was constructed. In 1895, Kenya was colonized by the British after the scramble and partition of Africa. And then the British therefore saw the need of educating the Kenyan masses for two reasons. One, with the civilizational agenda that comes with colonization, and two, with the agenda of creating individuals who can work for them. So what happened then, there were schools by the government and schools by the missionaries. In the schools by the missionaries, most of what was taught were the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetics. At the government, in government schools, it varied. In some government schools, the Kenyan students would be taught vocational technical education, so that eventually they could be employed on farms or in workshops that were run by the colonial masters. But there were other government schools which were for the elite Kenyans. We'll talk about them later on. What we see happening is that the Africans start advocating for their children to access an education that is beyond the 3 R's. And this emanates from the Africans who go to fight in Burma during the Second World War. And they start pushing that the children should have a better education where they can be leaders. So we see in various communities in Kenya, independent schools run by the various communities emerging. In this school, they are taught the same education like the same curriculum is pursued, and two, the students are also taught about their culture. Notably, in the other two classes, the African culture was not taught in the curriculum. So what happens in education in Kenya then, and what continues to happen, is that education continues to be a driver of developing an elite class. During colonial time, how this happened was that education in Kenya was highly balkanized along ethnic groups. I talked about the African-run schools. It was balkanized along race. So we had the European schools, Indian schools, Arab schools, and African schools. And then there was also the issue of rural and urban schools. So the Kenyans in the rural areas would be educated in the reserves, and the ones who lived in towns would be educated there. There's also the issue of religion. So the Muslims had their schools and the Christians had their schools. And among Christians too, you see a school by the Catholic Church, by the Anglican Church, by the Methodist Church, and by the Presbyterian Church, amongst others. Yeah. So a little bit about the schools that you're seeing here. These emerged as the elite schools in Kenya during colonial time, and some of them have continued to be elite schools. For example, the European Girls' School was a school for a lot of the girls who were daughters to the administrators and the missionaries. And eventually, after independence, it becomes Kenya High School, which is a national school in Kenya, and it's a school that attracts the creme de la creme after we do our national exams. So they get to select the top-notch students in every part of the country. And the same to Alliance Boys and Girls. So Alliance Boys and Girls is one of the elite schools that during colonial time was geared towards educating a critical mass of Africans who would take on jobs at higher echelons. So at these schools, there were white teachers and some African teachers, but you had to have performed well. And after going to these schools, the Alliances and the Prince of and Maseno School, during that time, these Africans who went to these schools, in most cases, they would go to, say, do their bachelor's in East Africa, Makerere, Nairobi, or University of Dar es Salaam, but some of them would go abroad. Most of them went abroad. They accessed scholarships from the government and from the US and the USSR through the airlifts. We can discuss about the airlifts later on. What education also did and continues to do is to shape the political ideologies of the masses in Kenya. By one, the curriculum. What is taught to individuals that access education? For example, after independence, there was a push for the education system to reflect the identity of the Kenyan. So, and then in the 80s, there's a shift whereby the education has to be very African socialist. And then presently what you see in Kenya is an emergence of elite private schools. These schools either pursue the public school curriculum or they pursue international baccalaureate, either French or American or Canadian, because individuals who access these schools can afford to travel abroad and study or can go into yet other private entities at university levels. So how has education in Kenya changed? Education in Kenya has changed due to commissions. Every time the community or the Kenyan people complain about the education system, what happens is the government quickly comes up with a commission to ward off those concerns. For example, but also there's been times when it has been very important that we make the change in education. In 1964, for example, we had attained our independence in 1963, and the curriculum was mostly British. So there was a change that was needed to infuse in a curriculum that represented the Kenyan identity. So the education system was changed from being mostly like the British, but still remaining the same, but to a system whereby individuals would go to primary school for 7 years, then they'd go to high school for 4 years, then that's ordinary level, advanced level for 2 years, and go to the university for 3 years. Because we just gained our independence, it was important that these individuals don't pursue vocational and technical education, because we needed individuals to replace their colonial masters. But then after this, education system had been on for a long time. We see the Mackay report later on that I'll speak to, so not the Mackay report and when it's executed in 1981, because it influences the 844 system, and the Kamunge report that I'll speak to later on. So a little bit about the 844 system. It's a system that means that you take 8 years in primary school, 4 years secondary school, and 4 at the university. So why the 844 system? After colonization, like I said, the need to educate a population that would replace the colonial masters was there. But then after some time, in 1981, there was a commission that was requested to look at the education system. And what they found out was that the individuals who were going through that education system could not be self-employed. They did not have some skills that would enable them to get self-employed. Another critique of that system was that it was developing these individuals that were very elitist. Therefore, they thought that we want to develop Kenyans who can be self-employed, Kenyans who are community-oriented, and they also wanted to reintroduce vocational and technical education. So that's what the 844 system ended up doing. So the 844 system then therefore was, you had to take 12 subjects, and one was maths, English, then the vocational education, the sciences, and religious studies, history. It was a whole workload of 12 subjects that a student had to take, plus going to the workshops to learn woodwork, to learn some engineering. So what happened then is that the workload appeared to be a lot for the students. The teachers had not been prepared to educate their students, and the amenities required to have this education was not in place. So this system was seen to be not fulfilling what it was supposed to do. So another commission came up, the Kamunge Commission, and looked at what the education system was about, and what they argued was that it was highly exam-oriented. There was a lot of rote learning. The students were not able to take on the vocational and technical education as was supposed to be, and the education generally needed some change. One of the changes that occurred is that the workload was reduced to 9 subjects from 12. So, but the struggle for how vocational education should be taught and technical education continues to be a problem that we have. Some schools have got the amenities, some do not have the amenities. The schools that have the amenities tend to be the elite schools, and yet in those schools, the students who go there don't want vocational education. It's seen to be for people who are not stellar students. So the amenities are with the students who don't need them. It's something that is still a challenge to the 844 system. But there are strengths to the 844 system. For example, it continues to be a system that produces a lot of the workforce that can be found in East and Southern African countries. Many Kenyans work not only abroad, but in the East and Southern African belt, and they work at managerial or director level. Many Kenyans who've gone through the 844 system also, when they go to other schools abroad, still perform as required. So much as we say it's a weak system at home, internationally it's relatively recognized to be a system that produces students that can perform. But I must admit, after studying this education system and the way we change our system, it is plausible to say that we have a system of education that keeps on changing but remains the same. We struggle with this issue of vocational education from colonial time up to now. We're always introducing it and removing it here. I'll go to funding. Where do we get funding for our universities? We'll speak to that later on, but primary education is free. It has its own problems. Students who go to day schools, by day, I mean individuals who go to school and come back at home in the evening, have free education, but it's not all of them. Schools that are private are expensive, and these public schools are the ones that are free. Most of the Kenyans at high school level go to boarding schools. And then Kenyan students also access Higher Education Loans Board. And if you want to understand more about the Kenyan education, there's that report that you can look at. Just a repetition of how our education system is. The early education, in most cases in the cities, a lot of the students from age 4 go to kindergarten or pre-unit, but in rural areas, they don't. So in some rural areas they do, but mostly they'll stay at home with their parents. Then at age 6 or 7, they start standard 1, and age 13 or 14, they're at standard 8. Then we take a national exam within 5 days in November to examine what you've learned for 8 years. And that's what decides the type of high school you'll go to. Then we go to Form 1 and Form 4. And after the 4th year, you also take an exam within 2 weeks that determines what you will be for life, whether you'll go to university or not. So our system of education is highly, students compete, it's highly seen to be a rote learning system of education, and it's also a type of education that is exam-based. And everyone who goes through, when students are going through the education system, the whole family is going through it. You know, there's a lot of support sometimes because your results also mean some social mobility. Then after you finish your Form 1 and 4, you can go to polytechnic education, polytechnic school, which are like the community colleges here, or you can go to university. At university level, the government funds students who get B+ and above, but the points that someone can get to go to university is C+. Then you can go to the private one if you have money. But we have universities that cater up to master's and PhD. In the recent past, we have had a proliferation of public and private universities. The issue of how the quality of this university is still remains to be researched. This is just a snapshot of where our universities were in 1975. For example, we had 2 public universities in 1975, and by 2002, you see that the numbers had skyrocketed. Same to the private university and colleges. In a sense, we're saying that we have 7 public universities, we have 24 private universities, and we have numerous vocational schools and colleges. Because we're teachers, we also want to emphasize how teacher training is done in Kenya. After Form 4, individuals can pursue training. The ones who don't go to university can pursue it from S1 level, which you can teach at technical schools, to P1, P2, P3, and P4. The P meaning primary, you can teach at those levels. And then you can go and pursue a bachelor's of education at university and become a teacher in high school level. Currently, there's a push for the primary school teachers to pursue bachelor's. And in some cases, you'll find the primary school teachers have taken on bachelor's to teach in high school and are waiting for a position to come up for them to teach in high school as they teach in primary school. Again, there's a report that you can look at on teacher education in Kenya.
And then I guess I'll talk a little bit more about Vision 2030, which is driving reform in the country, and it's the government's plan that was implemented in 2008 and is focusing on reaching certain goals and agendas by the year 2030. And education is addressed under Vision 2030 under the social pillar, and one of the things that you see that is the top thing is recruiting more teachers. And so, as Anne mentioned, the teachers can, in Kenya there are two big categories of teachers, those who have got undergraduate degrees and those who don't. And so in this recruitment process, there's a challenge in terms of funding for the teachers and in terms of recruiting them. Some of the other things that I'll just point to you really quickly, and maybe you can look as we go, but one of the things that is interesting is the introduction of a voucher system. And so when you think about how contentious that has been here in the United States, when you consider voucher systems in charter schools, it will be interesting to think about how that will happen. And consider the fact that they say it's from 5 of the poorest districts. So if you're in the 6th poorest district, are you not up for that? Or also, what are the benefits or negative you know, reactions and responses to this voucher system. And then one of the other things that's really interesting is the idea of the construction of a boarding primary school in each constituency in the arid and semi-arid provinces, which are kind of desert provinces in the eastern province and the northeastern part of the country. And as I would note, that's also the area that's kind of high cattle rustling, raiding happening, and also very close to the tension with the Somali border. And maybe, Anne, during Q&A, you can talk a little bit about being in a boarding school and at a young age and the challenges, but also the excitements of that. So thinking about funding for the education system, one of the challenges is, as Kenya has made these leaps towards providing free primary and free secondary education for the children, one of the challenges has been funding. In 2004, after the new government that is currently in power was elected, free primary education was introduced within a week. And so there was challenges in terms of how does that look like in the classroom. So you need more teachers because you had an influx of students who previously could not afford to go to school and now are in the classrooms. And so, you know, what capacity is there in terms of textbooks, in terms of teachers, in terms of teachers' aides, if that is necessary and required. So there's been a lot of partnering with bilateral and unilateral organizations. The Japanese government through JICA, which is their the development arm, German government, DFID with the British, USAID, and the Chinese government. And so all these partnerships, of course, come with, you know, some kind of contingencies. And that's an ongoing conversation. The other thing that happens is there are a lot of non-governmental organizations, both religious and non-religious, that are involved in working with providing small scholarships to students or working directly in funding the creation and sustenance of different schools. And then the last one is individual projects. And you look at, you know, families and people like us who see that we have definitely been benefactors to the education system and, you know, been fortunate to have good education. We kind of go back into the community. And so perhaps before we close, I can just tell you a little bit about what we do. So I actually work with an organization called Siala Springs Academy, and it's a school in rural Kenya, and it's this top picture. I was there 4 months last year with those adorable little kids. And I am on their board, and one of the things that I do is prior to starting my doctoral work, after I finished my master's, I was working on a project writing textbooks for the social studies curriculum in Kenya. And so my publisher has been extremely generous and given textbooks to the school in terms of matching the sales. So if my textbook sells, so I'm invested in like pushing my textbook to sell, so if my textbook sells, then they provide different kinds of textbooks for the children there. The other thing that we do is we work with the community, which doesn't really have an industry locally, and so a lot of the people are subsistence farmers, and so we work with them to come up with creative ways for them to participate in the school and have their children attend the school because they are paying to provide a high-level quality of education. So it's a private school, but we work with the local community. So for example, if we know we will need to feed the kids rice and beans, locally people grow beans, and so we'll say a bag of beans costs 4,000 shillings. And so if you bring a bag of beans, we'll take out, you know, the 4,000 shillings. Whereas if they just took the bag of beans to the market, there wouldn't really be many people to buy it because everybody grows beans. But we, instead of going to purchase products from other areas, we're trying to invest into the local community. And maybe, Anne, you want to talk a little bit about Acacia?
I sit on the board of Acacia in Kenya as an advisor. Acacia in Kenya is an organization that was founded by my brother, Sam, who lives in Boston. And the kind of work that we do is that we support orphans and vulnerable children, and especially girls, in Mumias in Kenya by trying to fundraise tuition fees for them or getting individuals who can pay the tuition fees. Most of these girls will be high performers. They're orphans, and some of them, the parents are poor, but they perform. They've been identified to be performing very well. They are on their way to going to university, so they easily get sponsors sometimes. And we also provide food for the whole school. They get to have their breakfast and lunch. And we also buy books that they need, or they go to various libraries in Boston and get books that the girls can read. We buy uniforms and sanitary pads for them because some of them would miss school because of sanitary pads. And we also mentor the girls. I worked in Kenya for several years, and I have friends who now have very good jobs. So I ask them once in a while, go down and talk to these young girls who look like you and who want to be like you but never see individuals like you around them. I also I used to work in Minnesota with first-generation immigrant girls to go to college. So I know the struggles of a girl who is going to college as for the first time, and the mother or the father did not go to college. So I got the idea of the college tours that I do with these immigrant girls, and I have replicated that idea and with the girls. So they get to go to a city. They come from the village. They've never gone to a city. So when they go to the colleges, they also get to go to a city. They come to classes. They meet girls like them who are in college. So that's essentially what I do. But every month what I do is I look at the reports about the girls. You know, how is Nancy doing? Is she in college? Does she have food? How is she performing? Has she written to us, to a sponsor later? What is the budget? Who needs what next? How just generally feeding into the reports, both financial and the project report, and helping to manage the project coordinator every month. Then in the summer, this program is embedded in the UU Church, Universal Unitarian Church in Boston. I also help my brother with organizing trips for the various members to go for safari and eventually go be with the girls. So I organize for what they will do in Nairobi and what they will do once in the community, activities that have meaning for the girls. So those are the things that I'm involved with within this program.
All right, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask us points of clarification or
adults and youth to be able to get their education paid for. So, and just through a different budget or grant funding that we receive. One of the things that we came across was this past year was a lot of immigrants who come and either they have their papers or they have their degrees from home, but are having trouble finding work here because of either the degree doesn't match, or they have to take more classes or have to start over here in the American system. So I was just, I apologize, I was late, so maybe you had addressed it in the beginning. But what have you found to be some of the ways to bridge the gap between those who earn degrees back home and then coming here to work? What have you found in terms of any research that you've done a little bit, if any, related to that?
And Anne probably will have more to say since her research focuses a lot on this. But I mean, for me, one of the things that I look at is more in terms of structures. So I'm interested in, for example, thinking about structures in transnational context, but also in America and in Kenya. And one of the things that I found working with is a scholar called Teresa Perry, and she works on education in Boston, where I did my first part of graduate school. And one of the things that she has found has been the highest level of education among immigrant populations in America is out of the Nigerian population, and out of continents, the highest level is out of Africans, but that does not match income. So that's a structural problem. It's not necessarily an educational problem. I'm not going to, label it based on the isms, because that's, I think that would be too simple to put it in those terms, but I think that there's something structural going on. So there's that data available, but maybe Anne can talk about it more in terms of direct connections.
I worked in Minnesota with nurses on a project that the state of Minnesota had put in place for nurses, doctors, and pharmacists who had been trained in various countries in Africa and the Arab world to get their certification in the U.S. in order for them to work in Minnesota. And it was a need in Minnesota because Minnesota has got very many immigrants from the Liberians, Somalis, and even the Hmong, and they needed individuals who look like these populations at the hospital. So the government or the state was behind this. So what our organization would do, we'd identify the nurses, the doctors, and the pharmacists, and they'd give us their papers, what they studied. And indeed, many Africans or many individuals who are immigrants are very well educated. Somali doctors would have been, they studied in Somalia and have gone to Italy and studied medicine again. And now in the US, they have to do it the third time. Yeah. But so their papers would be looked at, and then they would find the gaps, because a lot of the doctors who are trained in Africa do tropical medicine. But they need to come here and do their internship, do their board exams, and then eventually find schools whereby they can spend some years and practice medicine. So eventually they did. It took long years. But I've seen doctors who've achieved their dreams once they've come into the States. The nurses, it was a little bit faster. But there are some careers which immigrants come to the U.S. with that they will have to just start with a bachelor's. In Minnesota, it was the efforts of the state to see that these individuals manage to work within their profession. But that, you're right, that continues to be the struggle for many immigrants. We, from Kenya, are a little bit lucky because we come from an Anglophone country. A lot of the immigrants here come from French-speaking countries, the DRC. So it's more, in most cases, they have to start from a lower level, and unless they get to an organization where their grades can be converted. And some of them come from a war-torn country, so they don't have the papers. In that case, they have to just start from the beginning. Oh, yeah, okay. I went to boarding school when I was 8 years old, and I went to boarding school because, a little bit about boarding schools in Kenya. Boarding schools came up, they were within the missionary schools. So in various communities, there are boarding schools for girls and boys. When you're young, some from when you're 6 years old, and and then the high school ones. So I went to one where we could go when we were 6 years old, but there were all the girls who came from around who would come to and go home. So I went to boarding school because my parents were civil servants. We kept on moving from cities to cities. And also in my community then, if you were going to give your child a good education, your child had to be in boarding school too. So I went to this boarding school where people from my community, people from all over the country came. So people who are my age in my country, I know most of them because I went with them to primary boarding school and then we went to high school. And the area that I went to, we used to perform very well during that time. So we all went to national schools. So the reason I went to that school is one, because my parents were civil servants, and they kept on transferring, and I was going to all these schools. Then I went to that school, but I also wanted to go to boarding school. And I went with my sister. There were many other people who would be there from all over the country. There were kids whose parents would be diplomats but would have them there. So I got to experience children who lived abroad who I wouldn't have if I had have gone to a school in my area. Though I must admit, the school I went to, when I went to school, the Kenyan schools were just getting desegregated. So I went to school. The first year I got there's some white kids and some Indian kids. The second year they disappeared. But I'd see them in town Now they're my friends on Facebook. We've never discussed that here, but they went to another school. So then I went to the boarding school. Yeah. So the schedule of the boarding school is that we woke up at 5 o'clock, we showered, we went and prayed, and then we took our breakfast. By 7, we were in school. We went for our morning prep. 8 o'clock, we went to the parade, and we would, there were some announcements, and of course some naughty girls would be punished. And then we would go for class. And then there would be, at 10 o'clock, there'd be break. Then we'd go to the boarding section and have our break tea or porridge. Then we'd come back to class. And then at 1 o'clock, it'd be lunchtime, so we'd go to the boarding school. And before we have meals, we'd pray. There was a lot of praying. And then we would play with each other, too, because class starts at 2 o'clock. And then come back to class, take our afternoon session. Then at 3 o'clock, we'd all have a break where we'd go and play. And then go to the boarding section and just be there with each other. And then the nun would ring a bell. At 5 o'clock, we'd have our prayers, have our dinner. Then by 6 o'clock, we'd go for our preps again until 8 o'clock. Then the bell would be rung again, and we'd go to the boarding section, have our prayers, sleep, wake up in the morning. But we slept in dorms, so we had a mother in every dorm who took care of us, and also my older sister took care of me too. So yeah, and then we had one day in the month when our parents would come and bring us nice food. Yeah, but the food we ate was kind of routine. We either ate corn and beans, we took porridge, we took tea and bread, and we ate meat once every week. So it was highly vegetarian. Ever since I've become a vegetarian eventually as an adult. And yeah, so that was kind of how it was in boarding school. Yeah. It was a Catholic boarding school, yeah. But there were other schools which would not be Catholic. Seventh-day Adventist, Methodist, Presbyterian, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Extend a little bit about how the parents were involved in these educational schemes. I was really impressed with your example of, buying directly from the parents, let's say the beans that would be used. And so I guess, I'm assuming because probably the parents had limited literacy levels themselves, and I was wondering if there was any opportunities to sort of extend their own learning as their children were developing themselves as well.
Well, for me, one of the things that's was helpful and I find always very exciting is that having grown up in the city and then going back into the rural community, there are all these different knowledge gaps that I have. So I don't know what it means to live in the village. Or the other thing about it is so my education system was slightly different from Anne's. I did not go to boarding school, but I did the Kenyan education system for 8 years, and then I did the British education system for 6 years, and then came here. So there are clear gaps in my education that then when I go and interact with the parents, we start from a point where we're both learning. So I think that there's a level in which we're both learning and we have this shared education and we have this shared passion of seeing that the community advances and not necessarily seeing the need to do that by sending children away. So some of the things that we experience is there's usually a lot of parents just receive information. Like they're told, okay, you have to go and vaccinate your child for polio. And they have no idea what that means. So then there are all these questions that they just want someone to sit down and explain to them. In the same way, when I go into these communities, and specifically this one community, which I've worked with since I was 16, I have a close affinity with them. And, there's an openness in which they can ask me any kind of question. And I also am entirely, constantly learning so much from them. So I don't know if that gets back to your question, but I think that there's that openness that doesn't necessarily come in the same way when you have, say, a foreign donor come into a community and immediately it's seen as money walking in. For me, it's over 10 years of working in the same community. to that? Or no?
Okay, yeah, just a little bit about our school. This school is owned by the community. The land was donated by one of the parents. So the parents are really involved in the lives of the girls. The girls, we don't have, it's not a boarding school. It's a school where we haven't yet built the domes, so they walk home. Some of them walk for 4 hours. One of our girls, this is the sugar belt area. Her home is inside the sugarcane plantation. Her mom has to wake up at 5 o'clock and walk her to the road every day, and then see her, at least walk her to a road where she can walk on her own for the next 30 minutes to school. So she's really involved in this girl's life. In the evening, she's also still she waits for her on the road and takes her home. But we're working on having the domes for the fundraising now for this season is for a dome so that this girl can come there. The parents, even though they're illiterate, or the girls, some of them are orphans, there's a girl who is the only family member and has young siblings. They share with their parents their performance, because they have to write a letter or a report to their funders every month, and they share these successes with their parents. And the parents come every month with the locals, the chief, to hear how the whole school is performing and how the girls are performing. Then we didn't want the UU church to be far off from the girls or from the school, so every summer they go into the community to be with the whole school and to be with the girls and their family. Yeah.
All right. Do we, TJ?
I was really curious when I saw the slide on funding from NGOs, and I was just wondering, as a source of funding, I was wondering if maybe you could talk about, I know that Kenya has a very strong national infrastructure compared to a lot of other countries, especially its neighbors, but to what extent are international NGOs involved, and I guess like what kind of impact do they have on the curriculum, and also how are they perceived by the Kenyan people, I guess, the involvement of international NGOs within the education system?
So just purely structurally, I think that Nairobi is the world headquarters for the UNEP, the UN Environmental Program, and also the base for a lot of these international agencies. So one, it draws in a huge, local community of, both diplomatic people and also NGO organizations. But one of the things that's interesting about it is because a lot of these folks come in and they come in with their families because of the stability and also are also involved in the region, there's a sense in which, since their children are going to school in the country, there's some kind of speaking to these kinds of issues. Some of them go to the Kenyan education system. A lot of them go to either the British or the American school system or the French, German. But then there's that sense in which, as they're living in the country, there's that participation that happens. I think that I would say that it is our healthcare system and our education system are definitely largely involved, have a large tie to the donor community. For example, our textbooks have been purchased by UNESCO for I think the past 5 years or so. And so there's that sense in which also there's that accountability. And then textbooks are recommended by the government. So the government will say these are the textbooks that are supposed to be bought, and then UNESCO needs to vet them. And there's this whole, extended connection. In terms of, some of the non-government organizations that are religious or non-religious, quite frankly, I don't know. I have no idea.